With more knowledge, we gather the ability to comprehend more earnestly the fusion of science and morality. I think that if you give people information and you give them the opportunity to draw their own conclusions from that information, we all continue to learn more.
National security and defense are complex topics that impact the lives of billions of people on Earth. We all want a more peaceful world, but the eye for an eye mentality is still deeply ingrained in humanity. One journalist and author has spent years investigating, interviewing, and covering some of the most controversial topics in defense, national security, war, and geopolitics. That's none other than Annie Jacobson. Annie is the author of 7 books and is the consulting producer and writer on the TV series Jack Ryan. In today's episode, we cover many things, including how Annie got her strange start in these fields. We also cover her non-political approach to these delicate and, in some cases, recently declassified topics. Whether it's Area 51, the lesser-known Area 25, the origins of our intelligence agencies, DARPA, or profiling the group of covert operators that help protect our leaders, Annie Jacobson has researched it all. We cover all of that in today's interview, including some of the most interesting subjects, stories, and characters from her books. Plus, we wax philosophical and consider the ethical implications of technology wielded by human operators. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Annie's work is that she's influenced by the Eisenhower principle, which we discuss in today's episode. To get a glimpse of this principle, here's a quote from Eisenhower himself. "Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of a huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together." Now, let's jump into today's interview with Annie Jacobson.
This season of Hidden in Plain Sight is brought to you exclusively by our friends at Splunk, the Data to Everything platform. Splunk helps organizations worldwide turn data into doing. It's time for data to be more than a record of what happened. It's time to make things happen. Learn more at Splunk.com or by clicking the link in our show notes.
Annie, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to talk with you, and I know that you are fresh off of writing a new book, so I'm sure that's been a monumental process. Can you tell us anything about that?
Oh, goodness. No, that stuff's always, I want to say classified, but that's a bad joke. But no, I kind of hold my new books a little bit as jealously guarded secrets until they come out, because I always try to provide readers with, I guess, what you call news breaks, meaning things that people do not know and will be very surprised to learn. But I can tell you that the subject matter is a platoon of young men in Afghanistan. Things went horribly wrong for them. And I write in the big picture about the biometrics program that they were involved in.
That's fascinating, to say the least. And it sounds like a timely subject. So we'll be on the edge of our seats for that one. I was hoping to dive into some of the questions about your books that I have, because I'm fascinated by all of them. I have a background in the military. I'm very interested in media and the history of some of these large government programs and institutions. And you do a great job of summing them up with a little bit of flair and with a lot of investigative research. So I guess I want to start with your background as a journalist. What was the first piece of inspiration that kind of drew you to this field and the work you do today?
Well, I write about national security because it's the most interesting subject that I can possibly think of in terms of drama. And every journalist gets a break, hopefully. I think if you stick with it long enough, you surely do. And I got mine. I had been writing about issues having to do with homeland security in the world after 9/11. And it was like 2008. And I was seated next to an elderly physicist who at the time I thought was a, sort of semi-boring aircraft engineer. I knew he worked for Lockheed, but I imagined him doing something like designing windows. And he leaned over and said to me, I enjoy your reporting on Homeland Security, but if you want to write about national security, boy, have I got a story for you. And he proceeded to tell me about his work developing stealth technology going back to the Eisenhower administration. The CIA had just declassified one of the aircraft that he works on, which was called the A-12 Oxcart. That was the precursor plane to the SR-71 that was the Air Force non-classified program. And so you can imagine my surprise and enthusiasm when I found out that actually all that work took place at Area 51, and that became my Area 51 book.
Very, very interesting. That's the ultimate tip. I guess that's the journalist's dream, right? To have someone lean over and provide that. So you've written a lot about Area 51, and with headlines recently, many people are familiar about it. They're aware of it. I wanted to talk a little bit about Area 25, which I think is a great entry point into this this whole grouping of bases and research. Specifically, there was a research program there to build nuclear rocket engines that got a lot of momentum. You know, President Kennedy was there touring the Nerva nuclear rocket facility. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And I think it's particularly relevant today as we're getting back into space and with the recent SpaceX mission.
Absolutely. And also relevant to today, this idea that the current president is thinking of resuming nuclear testing is unfathomable to someone like me, having reported a lot on, the damage done by these nuclear tests, both out at Area 51 or out at the Nevada test site where Area 51 is, and also overseas in the Marshall Islands. So the fact that this is even being considered, I think, anyone who writes on nuclear weapons is just astonished. But Area 25, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's kind of like the doppelganger of Area 51, like its reverse twin. It had a public face in some ways, meaning the public knew about some of what was going on there. President Kennedy even visited it, and there's kind of an amazing old photograph of him. I think he's wearing Ray-Bans and looking really handsome and cool, as if nuclear testing was something that was, beneficent. But what was going on out there was, yes, this project to try and build a nuclear ship that was going to get us to Mars in the astonishingly tiny time frame of 124 days. So you can imagine the power it had to have to do that. And the idea, I do write about this in some length in Area 51, but the idea, the short version, was to create this sort of monstrous ship. It was going to actually be 16 stories tall, and it would have to be piloted by 150 pilots. And there was going to be 2,000 nuclear weapons on it. And they were small nuclear weapons. They were designed by a guy named Ted Taylor. And they were going to sort of roll out the back one by one, literally designed after the concept of an automated Coca-Cola depositing machine. And they also hired Coca-Cola on some of the early secret plans of that design, which is, those details are just like...
You can't make that up. That's crazy. Really, really interesting. And one of the things I noticed too when I was reading Area 51 is the scale of these projects and all of the different parties that were involved, like Coca-Cola that you mentioned, and other, large groups of people. Do you see digital media and social media today kind of inhibiting our ability to engage in secret, large-scale projects like this? Where do you see us at as a country as it relates to engaging in secret projects that might take years or a decade to bear any fruit?
What an interesting question. I mean, that's kind of touches upon everything that I think about and write about in my work, because it's not just nerdy national security stuff like what's keeping us safe and secret, but a lot of it has to do with the forward march of science, with this incredible idea of where we are now, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're a 15-year-old like one of my sons or a 95-year-old like a lot of the people I interview. We all remain amazed, I think, by when you're born and when you're a young person, the technology that exists for you is like radical, right? And then as you get older, it becomes even more radical, perhaps harder to understand. And yet you see the next generation of people perfectly comfortable with this technology that is like way beyond the elder statesman could have imagined 90 years ago. Like my 15-year-old son, for example, can create a whole video on his iPhone and, from multiple sources and then edit it and then upload it to social media. And that would take me, God knows how long, because I go back to the 80s when I learned how to do video editing in college, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a roundabout way of getting to your question about where we are now with social media, which is that whatever is occurring, whether it's with spies looking at us or our countermeasures against that, both parties are working to keep up with the Joneses, if you will. I mean, that is the essence of the military industrial complex, that defense contractors are forever making weapons that built into that weaponry is the fact that they will eventually, sooner if not later, become obsolete. And so what does that mean to the forward march of science in terms of military technology? I think that may be what you're asking me.
Definitely. Yes. And I think what's interesting, though, about a lot of these defense innovations is that they have these commercial potentialities that can be channeled away from uses for war and instead uses for commerce or collaboration, whether we look at ARPANET or whether we talk about some of the efforts at Area 25, like nuclear rocket engines to get to Mars. Are there any other examples you have of DARPA created inventions or technology that was designed for war, for defense, that turned out to be an effective collaboration tool?
Oh my God, everything. I mean, everything is that interplay between, as they say, dual use, right? To frame our discussion, think about this, because I find this so interesting, and I'm always going back to this concept in terms of how science moves forward, right? Like, so in 1946, when, so the whole sort of modern national security establishment as we know it today was created in 1947 with the Defense Act. So you think in 1946, right around that time, home radio was only 20 years old, literally. Then you push forward to the 70s to 1976, and you've got NASA landing a spacecraft on Mars. Think about that time frame, right? And then it just goes faster. I mean, 20 years later, you've got DNA being, the sequencing of DNA being patented. And then in 2009, I think about that landmark moment when the Kepler spacecraft discovers that you've got Earth-sized planets orbiting other stars. I mean, people couldn't have comprehended that when you go back to the days of radio. And then another big date I often think about in terms of your question about like both dual use and also national security, like what does the other side have? I think about how in 2016, so America was always, we having sort of pioneered the idea of big data processing, or first, inventing sort of the computer systems that are used in that manner, and then bigger and processing systems that DARPA was so behind. And then I think about that in 2016, for the first time, China took the pole position on supercomputing. And they did a lot of it by allegedly, stealing a lot of information. But then they're able to perform 93 quadrillion calculations per second. And if you go back in time to when the National Security Act was created, or in the late 40s, you've got John von Neumann, still a human, able to calculate faster than the first computer, the ENIAC computer he created. So just think about the speed at which things change. So that's all could really be overwhelming to think about, or you could just say, oh, whatever measures and countermeasures were going on, right after we won World War II, those same measures and countermeasures are going on today with the technology that we have.
Right. And in all of these cases, you talk about dual use, and the challenge is humanity and ethics, because we're being augmented by these technologies in ways that were unimaginable decades ago. So, is there any commentary you can provide, or maybe anything hopeful about the evolution of human ethics, especially as it relates to individuals inside these agencies that are spearheading projects or countermeasures?
Again, that's such a really interesting question that could probably, you and I could probably spend 6 hours talking about, right? So after I wrote The Pentagon's Brain about DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the most powerful, one of the most secret military science agencies in the world, where you would think that question might be answered, right, about morality. And there's lots of things in there I do write about, robots and generals discussing AI and is it moral, and, giving people, doing tests and operations to see if you can give drugs to people to make them drop their moral judgments about things. I mean, all kinds of sort of dark programs that exist within that agency that I report in that book. Then after that, jumping over to Surprise, Kill, Vanish, about humans who are asked by the President of the United States to kill people. And when I think about those two parallel subjects, that's the best way to answer the question. Meaning, people often think like, how dare people be assassins? And some of my critics of that book misinterpreted the idea that I was somehow condoning Title 50 operations in which the president asks humans to, go out and kill people. When in fact, to me, it's a opportunity as a human who lives in a world of technology and thinks about national security issues. The crux of those two situations, I think, is where the more thoughtful answers about this conundrum lie. Because at the end of the day, it should be the humans, this is in my opinion, it should be the humans that are in the position to make those existential decisions and not the automated machines. And I write about this in all of my books, about how it's not a cliche that it's easier to, push the button on a drone strike from Creech Air Force Base in Nevada. That's a real truth, that is easier than to be an actual human with the power to take someone else's life, as I write extensively from the firsthand perspective of operators who did those surprise, kill, vanish missions for the president.
Really well said. And I appreciate you tackling such a difficult topic, which brings us to, the central themes of human agency that run through your work. I think it's a good time to point out that one of the things that you say is that your work's inspired by the Eisenhower principle, i.e. that an alert and knowledgeable citizenry is best for the nation. Tell us a little bit about that inspiration and why you feel it's good to involve the public in this debate that's going on.
I'm actually someone who really believes people are inherently intelligent. And I think, like technology, we keep getting smarter. We keep gathering, with more knowledge, we gather the ability to comprehend more earnestly the fusion of science and morality, let's say, right? I think that if you give people information and you give them the opportunity to draw their own conclusions from that information, we all continue to learn more. And that is why I leave politics out of everything I write, and why I work from that Eisenhower principle. And I share that often with my sources when they say, why should I talk to you? particularly now in the world in which we live in 2020, where journalists, and again, this is in my opinion, print journalists or, people who are writing for newspapers are almost required to have a partisan opinion about things. And I have a luxury that I get to write long form books that are 400 or 500 pages. So I don't have to have a political opinion, and I don't. And that allows me to say to my sources that Eisenhower principle. It doesn't matter if they're a Democrat or a Republican, because it's so well said that an alert and knowledgeable citizenry is the best thing for the country. It doesn't say choosing a side and screaming at the other side and thinking they're entirely wrong about everything is the best thing for the country. And I really believe that firmly.
Definitely. And spaces where we can have nuance and long form 400, 500 page books, it's critical, because I think it was Albert Mays that said tyranny is the deliberate removal of nuance. And I think what we see happening in social media now is this removal of nuance. And these issues are not going to be dealt with in 180 characters. So as you went on to write a book called Phenomena, I'd be very curious to know, what was the thread of that inspiration like? Was there a conversation? Was it just, encountering research papers? Was it SRI? Where did that book come from?
I was fascinated by the fact that the real driving force behind all of those programs and Phenomena is about the government's and the intelligence community's interest in, psychic phenomena or telekinesis. That's sort of the splashy headline of the book. But really what it's about is the fight, if you will, for understanding the executive control system of the human mind, right? So it goes back to that area you were talking about with morality. And there's no coincidence that a lot of the early scientists from the Phenomena program worked on MK Ultra, because that had the MK Ultra, that's the CIA program that is often thought of as mind control, although it was so much more than that. What that really was looking at who has executive control of the mind, and how does sentience work alongside perception, right? So what we know versus what we think we know. And that plays into the idea of morality, into decision-making, into consciousness. These are all threads of the same big tapestry, to me, that make, national security and defense and power and war all so, as you said, nuanced, because the inner workings of the minds of the mostly men and some women behind these big programs and the extraordinary impact they have on tens of millions of people, they do boil down to these single programs sometimes.
And these programs, they don't just appear at our current time in history, right? They appear as far back as millennia ago. I mean, recently you shared something on Twitter, some old stone tablets. Could you tell us a bit about when these programs or investigations into this type of phenomena started?
Oh my God. I mean, kings and rulers have been, hiring psychics since forever. And, even President Reagan spoke about that. I'm fascinated by people's deep desire to believe in divination, to believe in a psychic change, if you will, or like a transformative moment. To loop back of why I wrote Phenomena, and this kind of ties into space in an interesting way. But I had been looking at the in the archives, looking at the space program and photographs from the space program when I was writing Operation Paperclip, because of course so many of the Nazi scientists came here and built our space program. And I came across a photograph of an astronaut standing on the moon, reading something. I mean, literally reading. He had a piece of paper in his gloved hand. And I remember going, what? I mean, it was like the merge of the oldest tool in the world, or what I think of, and obviously not like a arrowhead is older, but the technology. That's what it is. Like reading is really kind of the first technology. I mean, without
Right.
reading and writing, you can't have science. You can't have history, recorded history. And so to see this guy standing on the moon in 1971 reading a piece of paper was like the ultimate, I have to know more about that. And the person reading that document was Ed Mitchell and the Apollo astronaut. And so I tracked him down and I went to interview with him, and discussions about that framed a lot of our interviews. And Mitchell, as I write in Phenomena, was absolutely convinced of that psychic phenomena was real, and he dedicated the rest of his life after he came home from the moon in pursuit of that. And he was ridiculed by most people in the space industry for that, but he believed it to the end.
And so he was conducting ESP type experiments on his way to and from the moon, correct?
He was, and that was what was so, you know, fascinating. What he told me was that he became, and this is documented elsewhere, when he was doing training for the moon, he was scuba diving to kind of enhance his breathing and his, control of the brain and the body and whatnot. And he was with several doctors in Florida who were also interested in psychic phenomena. And you have to remember, this is the 1970s, right? So, or the late 60s, early 70s when he was doing the training, and they got him interested, and they kind of convinced him, in my opinion, to try to do this experiment on the way to the moon. And when I was with Mitchell in Florida, he showed me the actual papers that he brought with him to mark, the time and the different things he was thinking about, that he was trying to send to mentally through mental telepathy, which he believed in, to a psychic in somewhere in the Midwest. I'm forgetting at the moment, a Swedish man. It was so remarkable to look at those documents and think, my God, they went to the moon.
It's pretty astonishing. And I just want to couch this by saying, we're based in Palo Alto, California. So conversations like this here amongst certain circles are fairly common. Russell Targ lives, I still think he lives in the area, and the Stanford Research Institute used to be nearby. How did SRI shape some of this research? And what are some of the early projects that you wish more people who might be on the fence about these subjects would investigate?
I mean, I don't know if I wish they would investigate them. I mean, I remain agnostic as to my position on what I think of phenomena. And I think that's a little bit more of a hard-hitting word than neutral, because this area and any of those scientists who are all super interesting people, the majority of whom are still alive and still working in this field, I mean, they are, true believers, right? They've dedicated their lives to understanding and trying to prove, the validity of their work. And I think that's interesting, and I'm grateful to having been able to interview them. My position on phenomena itself is less important. I think what's more important is me recording the history of what they did, right?
Right.
SRI was the primary laboratory for the CIA's experiments. And if you move forward to the end of those experiments, which sort of wrapped up in 1975, this was the CIA's statement on it, which I just find fascinating, right? They said, a large body of reliable experimental evidence points to the inescapable conclusion that extrasensory perception does exist as a real phenomenon. I mean, that's pretty remarkable coming from the CIA. That was a classified document at the time. I just infinitely find that interesting. So is the phenomena that the CIA was pursuing and that the SRI scientists were pursuing, was it able to hold up to the scientific method? No. So why did CIA say that? I think that remains a really interesting enigma.
An open-ended question for sure. I like how you used enigma there. And when you shifting gears here to Surprise, Kill, Vanish, which is now out in paperback for anyone that's curious, with such an interesting and arresting title, when you're going into this pretty dark place of research and information gathering, how did you kind of keep your perspective throughout this? Did you come away feeling optimistic? Because some of the individuals you profile, although they had to do things that I can't even really moralize them, they did some unimaginable things, but they still seemed like good people. So I'm just curious about how you kind of kept your perspective and how you remained impartial as you dealt with this really tricky subject.
Well, for starters, Surprise, Kill, Vanish was the actual motto of the OSS Jedburghs during World War II. And so I found it fascinating when I was just starting out on this, that when we, or I should say I, would imagine the OSS Jedburghs killing Nazis with the Surprise, Kill, Vanish motto, right? Jumping out of aircraft, stealthily meeting up with their indigenous force partners on the ground, let's say the French, and running and, killing Nazis with piano wire. It's okay to be like, well, thank God they killed those Nazis, right? If we're talking about morality here. And then elsewhere, there's another legal enemy of the state, and somehow that is, makes you feel immoral hearing about it because it wasn't a Nazi. I mean, that alone is really interesting to me. And I know that feeling, so I think that's interesting, right?
Right.
I was also like, how incredible that the United States has a program to kill people, and you can call it anything but assassination, right? I mean, every time someone gets killed, whether it's Soleimani or whoever, the whole world starts tweeting out or writing out, whatever, that we have this executive order 12333 prohibits assassination, and how dare they? Well, that's just absolutely factually not accurate. What is accurate is that executive order 12333 exists. It was sort of like went through these different incantations, starting with President Carter, then Ford, up through Reagan, right? This executive order against assassination. But what's left out of the mix is that any president can overwrite that executive order with what's called a memorandum of understanding, an MOU. And this information is confirmed to me by the CIA's lawyer of 3 decades, who authorized these MOUs going back to Carter. So how fascinating is that people just want to believe that this is something that is prohibited when it's actually not. And I think that's a great metaphor to try to, approach one's own thinking about these kill operations. They're called direct action. They're called a bunch of different things, but, does it make sense what I'm saying about how
It does.
Before you even start thinking like, oh my God, this is immoral, you have to stop and go, wait a minute, what is going on here? And if you can look at the facts, let me give you an indication of what the different presidents have called their assassination programs over the years, okay? Because if you say assassination, then everyone goes, oh my God, right? But Eisenhower called his assassination program. And by the way, these are all from declassified documents, which I located in the National Archives, and any citizen can go read themselves. President Eisenhower called his program to kill people, leaders of foreign countries, the Health Alteration Committee. President Kennedy called his executive action. To Reagan, it was called preemptive neutralization. George Bush called it lethal direct action, and President Obama called it targeted killing.
Very wild. And at the same time, it's illuminating into the mindsets of each administration. And I just wanted to bring up the fact that as we're dealing with these subjects, it's important to note how much, how much of these administrations and leaders and national security officials really are putting themselves at risk by serving us in these positions, right? These positions are inherently unsafe. They are the target of numerous foreign plots and, attempts at hurting them, sabotaging them. You just go down this laundry list of threats they faced. I wonder if you could speak to the nature of threats that they're facing, because, the programs that we're describing did not emerge in this. I don't think they emerged from an offensive mindset, right? They emerged from a defensive posture. Or maybe you would dispute that, but I would love to hear you speak on that.
Yeah, no. And when you say people in danger, do you mean the actual operators themselves, or do you mean the presidents who?
The presidents, the operators. These are just positions that are so public, and they're already, there's natural hatred built in from people and terrorist groups around the world for these elected officials. So it's not like these are safe positions that they're inhabiting.
Well, I'll give you a quote that says all of it, which is, CIA Director Helms, who ran JFK's assassination programs. After JFK was assassinated, he went, I believe he was talking to David Frost, but this was on a television show. And he said the danger of assassination programs was, and I'm paraphrasing, if we kill their leaders, what's to say they don't kill ours? And I'm paraphrasing, but that's very, very close to the actual quote, which is in my book. But
Right.
It's a really important quote, because it's saying, I think that's what you're asking. Like, in other words, isn't this going to be the vicious cycle? Isn't this going to,
An eye for an eye type mentality writ large. Yeah.
And that's why I spend quite a bit of time in Surprise, Kill, Vanish, writing about the CAT team, the counter assault team, which very few people know about. And it follows the president 24/7. It's not a Secret Service. It's not a traditional sort of follow around the president with sunglasses and, protect him. It's in the event that a situation happens where someone tries to kill the president, it's like warfare. It's a paramilitary unit. I mean, I interviewed Lou Merletti, who is the director of the Secret Service and one of the founders of the CAT team, and the 7th member of the CAT team, about the origins of this unit. It's remarkable. I mean, that is real history. I was just amazed that Merletti was able to share the information with me that he did, but I know it was for reasons that have to do with security, like reasons that have to do with perhaps a forecasting of what is possible and how seriously the president is protected. I mean, the newest, add to that all is that, and now anyone who sees sort of, the president flying around a city in one of the helicopters will see now an Osprey on either side flanking it. Those Ospreys are filled with CAT team members.
That's so fascinating. Yeah. And I've caught, I've seen that in when we were outside the DC area, and it's a really good reminder. So Lou Merletti, who you bring up, and Billy Waugh, I believe is how you say his last name. This is a really fascinating dynamic duo. Could you kind of speak to how they approached these, national security postures, and they're basically like strategizing on geopolitical issues, morality, ethics, and at the same time being very distinguished operators. Could you just talk about that dynamic duo for a little bit?
The two men are, they go back to Vietnam. Billy's 90 now, right? And Lou is several decades younger than that. Lou was a young guy in Vietnam and was a Green Beret. And Billy Waugh was already a legend, you know, and the operators in Vietnam that the Green Berets who were asked to become part of SOG, of MACV SOG, it's such a mind-boggling unit to think about. I can only just say, you know, if you're interested in it, please read Surprise, Kill, Vanish. Please read books by John Plaster on the subject. It just deserves its own, you know, several hours of discussion. But suffice to say that President Kennedy, when he sort of laid the groundwork for that organization, it came out of Kennedy's disdain for the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy switched the kill missions from the CIA to the military, in my opinion, dangerously so. I mean, it just, the short version of it is it messed up a lot of things. And these Green Berets became direct action operators on cross-border missions into Laos. And that's what Billy was leading. And lots of other of these individuals. And that, talk about moral quandary, you know. And I mean, I went back to Vietnam with Billy, you know, 50 years after he was killing people and they were trying to kill his people, and sat in the garden of the home of General Giap with Giap's lead commander who had been assigned to kill Billy, and Billy had been assigned to kill him. I mean, the whole thing is just, talk about a moral heavyweight, right? Considering these concepts. But the point of all this was that Lou knew about Billy because Billy was this sort of invincible character from SOG. And on top of having to do all these direct action missions, in his spare time, and I say that somewhat sarcastically, you know, Billy would go lead the green light missions to save people that had been, you know, go after guys who were down behind enemy lines, our MACV SAW guys, to pull them out on a rope from a helicopter. Just, you can't imagine. It's incomprehensible. And this is what these guys were doing in Vietnam. And so Lou knew about this. Lou had a best friend who died in one of those missions. And Lou is sort of looks to Billy as someone who is the remarkable person that he is. And the two men have stayed in contact over all the years. And Lou rose from this, you know, young kid, a young soldier, to becoming the head of Clinton's security detail, and then the director of the Secret Service. And so they work on kind of measures and countermeasures, if you will, of the president asking individuals under Title 50 authority to go out and kill people, and the other, Lou Merletti, being responsible for keeping, you know, that same president safe. And of course, there are hundreds and thousands of individuals that are, you know, equally significant in all of this. I just happen to write about the two of them.
Annie, thank you for being generous with your time. It's an honor to talk with you. I think the research and work you do is really important. I'd love to pull back to maybe a 30,000 foot view of the arena that you see. So you're someone who does this work and faces a lot of darkness, but you also get to see this side of humanity that many people don't. What's your view on the future in terms of where we're headed, where the technology is headed, and where the human nature in this, where are we going?
Such an interesting question. I want to say one thing first about like that I am someone who looks at this darkness, because I don't see it that way. And I think that's why I am able to maintain a neutrality, and why people continue to be willing to talk to me for my reporting. And I remain forever grateful about that, because I sit from a very privileged position as a woman who has never gone to war and yet lives in the United States and has all the benefits of living in a in a democracy that is flawed, but is extraordinarily safe and probably the safest place to live in the world. And
where we're allowed to talk and research these subjects at length.
It's astonishing to me that veterans would somehow be pulled into a political battle, particularly the one we see now. It causes me great worry, and I don't like it because I feel like what happened to the liberal Democrat who used to support, G.I. Joe? I mean, Saving Private Ryan. I don't know why people who fight for the United States of America are somehow politicized. I really honestly don't get it. And so this idea that I see the dark side, I don't see it at all like that. I see it as like, wow, I get an opportunity to interview with people who are doing a job that I either can't do or won't do. And that's not because of any other reason than circumstance, gender, whatever it is. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I think that having the courage to look at the prices that are and the tolls that certain individuals take upon themselves is fascinating. So I'd like to take it back to the Eisenhower principle here, where that an alert and knowledgeable citizenry is best for the nation. And if people really do the footwork to understand something, they can make a good decision. This is a great driving principle for your work. Are there any other principles or, things that you reflect on from time to time when you're in the trenches doing this work?
It's always no judgment, just no judgment. Just listen for what you determine to be the truth. Let me give you an example. I wrote a book called Operation Paperclip about the Nazi scientists who were brought to America after the war to build our weapons program. And the book published, I think it was in 2014, right? So this is a very different time in 2020, not nearly as political. And in my press tour, I could appear on Fox News and CNN at the same time, right? Now that could not happen anymore, which I think is really unfortunate. It could, but it doesn't. But you could then. And I would go on Fox. I'd go on, one side of the aisle, and the host read my book, and they would say to me, Annie Jacobson, thank you so much for writing this book on Operation Paperclip. You showed that, we hired these Nazis and they were terrible and et cetera, et cetera. But thank God that you wrote this book because you show us that if we hadn't hired these Nazis, we'd all be speaking Russian now. Then I could go over onto CNN and they could, or another, sort of liberal leaning program, and they would say, Annie Jacobson, thank you so much for writing Operation Paperclip. You showed us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you obviously were saying to us that no matter what, we should never have done this program. We should have hung everyone. And this was the most reprehensible program we've ever done. Two entirely opposite conclusions from the same book. I consider that a compliment because my opinion doesn't matter. Your opinion matters. What you think of a book that I write is what matters to me. In a strange way, it also sort of can't matter because if I listen to all my critics or the flatterers for that example, I wouldn't be able.
Nothing would get done. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't be able to hopefully write with the objectivity that I aim for, which is here are the facts. I mean, of course, I draw little opinions here and there, and in the end, I stick myself into my books so that you can see there's a real human there talking to real people. But really, I tell my kids this all the time, I value the opinions of other people, especially when they have different opinions than I do. That's why, in my opinion, America is a democracy.
That is the fountainhead of good collaboration and ultimately avoiding violence. Yeah, so powerful.
And so that's really the guiding principle is just read and think for yourself. Think for yourself.
Annie, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. And to everyone listening, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Sophia Bush, and you've been listening to Hidden in Plain Sight from mission.org. This podcast is sponsored by our friends at Splunk, the Data to Everything platform. In today's data-driven world, every company, big or small, new or old, is sitting on terabytes of unused, untapped, and unknown data. Splunk helps turn all that data into action. Using cutting-edge AI and machine learning, Splunk delivers real-time predictive insights that will help you on your mission to change the world. With solutions for IT, security, Internet of Things, and business operations, Splunk empowers people to make faster, better decisions and take action to get things done. It's time for our data to be more than a record of what happened. It's time to make things happen.